I'm Michael Jackson, the Executive Director of JFJ.
And I'm Jade Williams, the Policy and Advocacy Specialist.
Just want to remind our listeners that as you listening to the program, you can call the studio lines at 676-4996 or 239-7583. That's our WhatsApp number. And certainly you can join us live via the YouTube and you can chat with us there and we will see how best we can respond to your queries. So Jade, I want to start out by saying today is the International Day that recognizes female human rights defenders. So
wow.
Happy day to you.
And you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to express our big up, shout out to those who have stood with JFJ, all the female leaders that we have had over the years that really put us in a position of, despite all the challenges we're seeing with human rights in the country, certainly their fight and their sacrifices have been well noted. So to start the program, as usual, we're just going to be having a discussion about some of the main human rights issues that happened in the news last week. And I must say that JFJ called for the Senate, not just the parliamentary opposition, no, we called for the Senate to vote with the Constitution in rejecting the extension for a state of public emergency in the country. And people voted along party lines, but we're happy to note that the SOE, it ends tonight.
Indeed.
The challenge we're having, though, Jade, is that we're hearing that the government is considering simply restarting 14 days. And I am not sure if that would ever withstand a constitutional challenge.
Well, not for what it is currently being used
because
for.
If it's but even outside of what it is being used for, if the Constitution says to extend something beyond a 14-day, you need 2/3 majority. I don't think the Constitution needs to spell it out bullet by bullet to say you cannot restart it.
Yes.
So the inference is there. But even if it were to withstand a constitutional challenge, I think it flies in the face of the tenets of good governance and what the government is contemplating. So I would urge the government not to consider restarting the SOE without securing the parliamentary opposition commitment to an extension. Granted, we don't support that, but at the same time, we have to be careful what signal we're sending to the country.
We can hope, though, that the government will take the time that is between the SOE and possibly calling another to actually look into what other measures can be implemented to address these kind of issues.
And fix some of those troubling sections within the regulation. For example, 26, we spoke about that one that compels people to share information that of others who may be contravening the regulations, and that's suggesting that a public education was had with the Jamaican public that tells them what the aspects of the regulations are. That's putting burden on people without considering their safety.
Absolutely.
And there are other things. But as you talk about what the government should be doing, there is now the conversation about pre-charge detention and who first made that suggestion. Let me start by saying pre-charge detention is very problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to be making our position on the bail bill come Thursday to the Joint Select Committee, so we will speak more about it. But to the opposition and their suggestion, let me say this. It may be different, but what the opposition is suggesting is also very problematic. And I'm not sure if it will ever withstand also constitutional challenges, because you're basically saying, all right, the police won't grant you pre-charge detention, the judges will. But the police can go and make that application ex parte. In other words, the person doesn't need to be there. Where's the right to counsel? Where's the right to know what charges or accusations are being levied against you? So the opposition's suggestion, though different from the government, is also very problematic, and quite frankly, it ought to be rejected completely.
I'm gonna have to agree with you, Michaela. And as you said, we will be making our more detailed thoughts on pre-charge detention and other concerning provisions within the new bail bill public come Thursday when we make our presentation to Parliament. So we hope that those that are tuning into the show now will tune into that airing of the Joint Select Committee, so you can hear some of these concerning provisions.
And I'm sorry, I'm going over into your time, but there's one last challenge I have to point out.
When Michael gets passionate.
So the Prime Minister indicated that ESMA, the Non-Security Measures Act, the bill will be tabled come next year. I want you to take note of some of the proposals. Special detention orders, watch list, control orders. By the way, these are all anti-terrorism things, like, for example, the United States that would have done, the UK would have implemented, that saw persons of different religious minority groups being detained. If you think about Guantanamo Bay, if you think about the Cold War era that had Russian spies, it's like you're watching a movie and you're wondering what is happening in the country.
Yes. Is
this a police state or is it a free and democratic country? I think as we deal with crime, we have to ensure that the statutory laws, the ordinary laws that are being passed are constitutional. But I will stop there, Jade, and turn over to you.
Yes, well, thank you, Mikhail, for turning over to me.
My apologies.
It's fine, and it is something that I think has a deserved amount of passion. So we go straight into our right of the day, which is the right to a fair hearing by an independent and impartial court. So this right allows you to defend yourself, to present proof of those defenses, and to give arguments to support your case. The court must remain neutral and must not favor one side over the other. And the court and the persons making the decision, which might be a jury, in some cases there is a jury, must not have any personal or professional ties with you or anyone else involved in the case. So this means your case should be considered completely impartially, right? And we go straight into our trivia of the week. And this week's trivia question is, what term of imprisonment is possible for the breach of a protection order? And if you would like to respond to our trivia question, you can call into the studio at 876-676-4996, or you can send us a WhatsApp message at 876-239-7583, or a DM on Instagram at JA for Justice.
All right, great. Very important, right, that Jay just pointed out. But we're just going to switch gears a little bit into today's topic, which is improving the laws and the community responses to gender-based violence. And we're going to be joined by Rochelle Gray, who is a region officer with E for Life, Dr. Karen Carpenter, senior lecturer with the Institute of Gender and Development Studies, Patrick Layla, policy and advocacy officer with Jamaica Aid Support for Life, and our very own Reverend Father Sean Major Campbell, JFJ board member. Jada, want to start out?
Of course. So from November 25th, we would have recognized the International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women and the commencement of the 16 days of activism. In 2018, the UN showed that Jamaica had a high prevalence rate, about 27.8% of domestic violence. More than 1 in every 4 women in Jamaica experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime, and the data also suggests that a quarter of the nation's women are exposed to violence before their 18th birthday.
Now, in July 2022, Xavier Main, the Minister of State in the Ministry of National Security, said the annual number of reported cases of domestic violence increased from just over 4,000 to 8,000, which suggesting a rise of almost 100%. Very alarming there. JFJ, we have also seen increase in the number of persons making reports and seeking redress from the organization. Now, since the start of COVID in 2020, we have received just over 80 reports of persons seeking legal assistance, protection order, occupation order, and so on from the JFJ team.
So we are not the only ones seeing the necessity to address some of these issues. The government has also noted its commitment to addressing these issues and has shown this by the implementation of the Sexual Harassment Act. But also there are several other gaps that need to be addressed.
Now, speaking at an IDEVA event on November 25th, the Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, Olivia Babsy Grange, emphasized that several pieces of legislation are being amended to address those gaps, and she noted that the government is starting with the Domestic Violence Act. Other noted changes include amendments to the Memorandum of Objects and Reason to the recently passed Firearms Prohibition, Restriction and Regulation Act to ensure that there are greater protections for victims who are in abusive relationships with partners who are licensed firearm holders.
As part of our continued work to address these issues affecting women, Jamaicans for Justice wrote an open letter to the 84 members of parliament on November 24th regarding several legal reforms that can be taken up to address domestic violence and other issues that affect those affected by domestic violence. While we note the minister's comment on drafting instructions for amendments to the Domestic Violence Act, we note that there are no definitive timelines provided as to when these drafts will be completed. Furthermore, the sexual harassment law was gazetted in November 2021. However, there has been no commencement date attached to that law, so therefore it is not enforceable.
Now, in addition to the overhaul of the Domestic Violence Act, JFJ, in their open letter, we called on the parliamentarians to act on the 2018 recommendations from the Joint Select Committee report, which noted that the Sexual Offences Act and other pieces of legislation, such as the Offences Against the Persons Act. And remember, these recommendations are critical for dealing with sexual offences and rape, for example, defining rape and so on. Now, we're going to be joined, as I said, by Dr. Karen Carpenter, Reverend Father Sean. Patrick Layla will join us in studio, and of course, a brave lady, Rochelle Gray, will be with us. We're going to take the break, and then we have the discussion after.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We are talking today about improving laws and community response to gender-based violence. We are joined by Dr. Karen Carpenter, Ms. Rochelle Gray, Mr. Patrick Layla will be in shortly, and Reverend Sean Major Campbell. So I want to start out with you, Dr. Carpenter. One of the proposals that Jamaicans for Justice, amongst others, have made is that there needs to be a clear definition of domestic violence in law. What, if anything, do you think about that proposal? Or is that something you share?
Yes, and absolutely. We cannot operate without definitional terms, and definitional terms that bind all of us, both those who come before the law and those who seek to enact the law. There has to be some clear parameters as to what we imagine these things are to be. Otherwise, it becomes arbitrary and subjective.
Yes. As a follow-up, Dr. Carpenter, welcome to the program.
Well, I've been listening so keenly. I feel that I've been on the program for a long time.
Perfect. Now, you spoke about the definition, but can you just paint the context for us so we understand the challenges we're facing as a society when it comes to gender-based violence?
Well, we began by speaking of domestic violence,
yes,
which is a broader term, and then gender-based violence, which is also part of domestic violence. So I think we need definitional terms for both the broader context, which is domestic violence, and those sub-contexts, which include intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, etc. These mostly take place within private settings, as opposed to public assault. And I think we have to have definitional terms that allow the public, because laws are for the people of the land, yes, that allow the public to be able to distinguish and identify which of these we're speaking about when a charge is made or when they wish to make a charge. So I think we have to disaggregate, pull them apart, and define them succinctly in plain terms and show the difference between the various types of violence.
I just want to ask you one more thing, because you said types of violence, and I know for some of our audience members, when you talk about violence, there's only one thing: physical violence. So
absolutely,
when we talk about types of violence, what exactly do you refer to in the context of?
We can think of two immediate instances that come to mind. There is domestic violence that can include and does include whether you are threatening the person, whether you're using coercion, whether you're using verbal abuse. It doesn't have to be physical abuse. In other words, if I don't have a lick and a thump and a bruise, it means it's not violent. There's violent attacks that are verbal, emotional, and psychological. Equally, you mentioned the Sexual Harassment Act, which has not got a commencement date as yet. That also includes terms that I think culturally, as Jamaicans, we don't really pay much attention to. If it's not physical, we ignore the emotional harassment, we ignore the workplace harassment, we ignore someone being impeded in carrying out their job because they're afraid of an approach.
Yes.
So we tend to go for the physical above any of the non-physical things, above any of the emotional and psychological things. So our population needs to understand that these are part of the violent acts. You can be violent without touching someone.
Thank you. Rochelle Gray, are you with us? Rochelle?
Yes, I am here.
Welcome. You represent an organization that I personally admire, and the work that E4Life does in empowering our women and girls and ensuring that men play a role in ending this epidemic. What's your take on the call for the Domestic Violence Act to be overhauled? What are some of the challenges that you're seeing from where you sit?
Thank you very much. So it's very important that, and I do agree with the doctor, that we really have the definition across. In terms of the challenges will lie based on the fact that our young girls are not being focused on as a priority. It is very sad when it comes to when we speak about these things, we will talk about the adults, but we don't think about the younger generation as to the age group that we really truly work with, as to the link that domestic violence plays when it comes to HIV infection. That in itself is a different whole roller coaster. When it comes to the dependency in our society, not having an income, the fact that we profile these young ladies because they earn a certain amount, it means that they're not enough. When it comes to the aspect of the psychosocial support, that is lacking. We don't have enough psychologists within Jamaica to even serve these young ladies who are survivors of this trauma. So if we're not doing the work when it comes to the therapy, the mental health therapy, it means that we are breeding another generation to come, because if I am abused and I have a family, I have children, it means that I may not know any different, but to just grow my children up in that way. And so the cycle continues. Yes. So we need to be looking at the aspect of the psychosocial support, where we can go. So even though we may speak about it, but the reality on the ground, it is lacking. That is where we at E4Life would come in, because we would go beyond just sitting on our desk. We go into these nooks and crannies of the country to find these clients to ensure that we are giving the best care possible. So it's very important, but I mean, how effective will it be, how the longevity of it, that is where I would really like to see the support coming in. For documents being drafted and it takes how long to be passed, stuff like that. We need to feel as though it's important and act on such.
Thanks, Rochelle. Before I turn back over to Jade, Patrick Layla is with us in studio. Patrick is a very close colleague and friend of ours, so he's among friends, yes?
Yes.
I would hope.
And I see Doc on the line, so I need more among friends.
And we're also joined by Rochelle Gray of E4Life and Reverend Father Sean Campbell from JFJ. So, Patrick, Rochelle mentioned two critical things, and I want to turn them over to you to quickly talk about. Where are we with that report from 2018? Where are we coming from? And then perhaps at some point you will talk about the connection between the issue and HIV. But start out, where are we with the report?
Let's start where we're coming from. You mentioned 2018. Let's go back to 2014, where this process started, where we were a part of a collective called Verge that made submissions around the 4 pieces of legislation, including the Domestic Violence Act. That moved to... There was a change of government in the period. A new Joint Select Committee was appointed in 2016. Further submissions were made. Most of the agencies that were a part of the collective made individual submissions in 2016. And then 2 years later, in 2018, December to be exact, a report came out with some We didn't get all that we wanted, but there were some very good recommendations.
And a very bad one about willful transmission.
Yes, that one I'll get to. But there were some good recommendations, and then nothing happened after that. It just died. We heard nothing, and there was what's happening in 2021. Last year, Minister Grange made some announcements around there were 3 key issues she touched. The definition, I heard Rochelle mention the definition, ensuring that there's a definition of domestic violence in the Act, ensuring that the penalty for a protection order, which has been part of our advocacy, would be increased from $10,000 to $500,000. And she also spoke to one of the concerns we had, where there was too much focus on the physical, and as a result, the other forms of violence did not get covered in the legislation. So there was a focus to ensure that I think she did mention emotional, psychological, that those financial as well. But
just to chip in, I hope I don't break your thought. The Prime Minister had also sent a signal following the allegations of that incident with George Wright, that the government will be looking at seeing how best the police can pursue a matter without the victim being... Yes.
Right. And there are many different opinions in legal circles about that, whether it be if the parties in the matter do not wish to go, whether the state should overreach and go. But personally, I think some of these domestic violence matter. I was observing a matter with that one of my colleagues were doing in court today, which is exactly where we're coming from. And there was a lady there who was saying he chopped off my finger. She was showing the dismembered part. He stabbed me on the vagina and he stabbed me in the head. But, Your Honor, we want to work it out. This is what she was saying before the judge. And the man was standing there, all serious looking. He had injured her seriously 3 times. Now, this is where I think the state need to step in and say, no, we can't leave it up to the survivor, the victim,
who's abused,
to say, well, I don't think we should go any further with it. So I think there is some merit in that. We just have to look carefully at how we do it. But I think we need to go back and start at the fact that let us inform ourselves that domestic violence in and of itself is still not a criminal offense in Jamaica. It is the actions that flow as a result. So, for example, the police will tell you, where you say him just punch you up, where's the cut, where is the swelling, where it's almost, I'm seeing nothing. What am I going to take the man in and charge him for? It's all the other things. So it's when this stabbing happens, the chopping happens, the dismemberment of body parts, which now becomes an offense under the Offences Against the Persons Act. That is when it chips in. So we need to take a more serious approach as to how we treat with domestic violence. Besides all the little discrepancies that we see in the Act, I think we need to start with treating with
2014, 2018,
2014, 2016, 2018, 2021, and let us be minded that the legislation is still exactly what it was in 2014. Yes. Nothing has changed.
But we know, though, the statement from the minister.
I don't know that the statement is much comfort to me, Michael. I mean, we have heard statements all the time.
I laugh, but I don't find it funny. But over to Jay to bring in Father Sean.
I heard several things that that Patrick said that pushed me to a thought towards Father Sean, actually. Because Patrick would have talked about the victim coming in and saying, I would like to continue this, what is clearly a detrimental relationship.
Yes.
And I think about your position, Father Sean, as a mentor, a counselor, a religious leader, and what have you seen when persons come to you and report domestic violence issues? Because one thing we've heard from our reports is that persons would go and the first person they consulted was their religious counselor, their pastor, and they would have some form of counseling with that pastor where I don't want to misspeak here, but where the what appears to be the tenets of religious belief interferes with the victim actually receiving what is necessary assistance to come out of this abusive situation. So I wonder what your perspective on that is.
And I would say the problem occurs when we do not observe the basic human rights of all people. recognizing that when it comes to matters of human rights, our personal religious view really should not take precedence. And that is why I've always maintained where there is a conflict between religion and human rights, politics and human rights, philosophy and human rights, etc., the human rights position should prevail. Whenever I am seeing in front of me a victim or survivor of domestic violence, I know that I'm also seeing somebody whose capacity to make certain calls might actually be impaired when the call they want to make is in relation to the abuser. And to say, I can just forget it, I just want to move on. And we know what the cycle of violence looks like. And one part of in the cycle is where persons make up and so-called forgive and they're moving on. And sometimes they even have the religious leader pray for them and give them a lecture on forgiveness.
Yes. We're going to take, thanks Father Sean, we're going to take the break and then I'm just going to ask all four guests to remain with us, please.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We are talking today about gender-based violence reform, and we are joined today by several esteemed guests.
Yes.
I don't think I'm going to list them again, am I?
That's fine. But let's us switch to Dr. Carpenter. Dr. Carpenter, one of the things that we have seen, and it came up in several of JFJ cases, this whole aspect of mediation. And yes, okay. That's my position. I think you're about to articulate, but let me allow you to. What is the role? Is it useful? Is it something that we should promote? What are the dangers of using mediation when it comes to these matters?
Okay, so I want to go back to something that Father Sean mentioned, and you're speaking to colleagues that I also esteem, so I'm happy to be in good company. Father Sean mentioned the role of the church in terms of, let's say, pastoral services for couples, bringing them back together, and when we should separate the pastoral from the philosophical, from the psychological, etc. I think we move towards the notion of mediation because we do not actually recognize the lasting damage that is created even when there is a bruise and a mark and a stab wound, etc. We imagine that as the skin heals itself, then the person is perfectly fine. And I think that we must be very careful, certainly within psychology. As a psychologist, we have to be careful that a counselor is not a psychologist, and psychologists come in different forms. So our colleague from EFA Life, fantastic NGO,
yes.
Our colleague from EFA Life spoke about the fact that there aren't enough psychologists, and then she went further to say, working in this field. There are plenty of psychologists in Jamaica. There are just not that many who wish to work in this kind of trauma. Because we recognize domestic violence, sexual harassment, child abuse as trauma. That's how it presents itself. And I think we have to take a more psychojudicial approach.
Yes.
So, for instance, when I look at the amendments, I see where the increasing of the fines for breaching that Separation Act, the protection order, is recommended. But I would go further. I would say that that third point and the sixth point, which is mandating treatment, have to go together, because what is the purpose of separating a volatile couple for a period of cooling off time to then have them reconcile? Reconciliation is not what is needed when one is an abuser and one is the abused.
Yes, even as far as making a marriage proposal in the court.
Absolutely, and I heard of that one as well, which was ridiculous, and I followed the reports in the courts for the last 3.5 years, particularly over the COVID period, and I see the numbers of heinous, life-threatening crimes
yes.
that are committed even on pregnant women, and then reconciliation takes place. You cannot reconcile an abuser with the abused. the power dynamic is not the same. It's like saying you're going to reconcile a child who's been abused in the home
Yes.
with an adult who's abusing the child, because the power dynamic is not the same. And I want to know what we're doing about the perpetrator.
Yes.
Not because I think we should discard people, but we must do something. We must have interventions, and they should be tied to the protection order, and they should be mandated by the court, and they should be signed off on. Because once someone is suffering from Stockholm syndrome, which is the abused becomes bonded to the abuser, and they've done that since childhood, when their parents were abusing them. The abuser is often abused in childhood, and so is the abusee. But once that has taken place, it's a very dynamic bond, very strong bond, which reconciliation only puts a band-aid on.
Yes.
It actually condones abuse. So no, I'm entirely against reconciliation from any kind of human rights point of view and human life point of view. It is a ridiculous concept in this context.
Yes. Great.
You know, Dr. Carpenter spoke about, you know, merging the other interventions with the protection order. And Rochelle, I know that you are working closely with victims who would have sought out protection orders and maybe even received them. Is it having the effect that it is supposed to have? Is it actually preventing further abuse? Do you find that it's regularly breached? What has been your experience with that?
You would have seen breach most times, because sometimes when you do get the protection order, so in one case recently, it would have been that the survivor is also being reported on. Now the police at the police station, so most of the time the ball just when you go to the police station, of course, as to who is going to carry out this role, what is going to happen. And most of the time these police officers really, I would believe that they are trained, but the reality is that they don't perceive those type of behaviors. And it would mean that, so if this survivor is living in this person's household or they're in the same house, when you now carry out a protection order on that person, what is going to happen to that client? Or, you know, stuff like that. When it comes to, yes, there are shelters, but how many of us will be able to access it at that point? For our clients, we do try to support them as best as we can when it comes to liability support, stuff like that. But for the wider population, it is very hard. When it comes to our clients, because we have the information, we can educate them as to what to do, where to go, you know, but the reality speaking, it is scary and it is not safe, because most of the time the ball is just where the police are concerned.
So the police, they're not necessarily following up on those protection orders to ensure that it's being enforced.
Right. Because most of the time they'll say, oh, man and woman business. I mean, you can work it out, you know, and just as Patrick said, they're looking for the bruise, they're looking for, if you're not cut, if you're not bleeding, stuff like that, if you don't look like train just run over you a couple of times, it means that nothing happened really. So those are some of the things that we need to stop looking at the face of an abuse to say, okay, let us act on it.
Thanks, Rochelle. There was a case during COVID that stuck with me that JFJ received, and I think when I was at Jamaica Aid Support for Life, we saw a similar case, Patrick, where women went to the police station to make reports. And one of those women, she was told to go back home because she's breaching the curfew hours. Another one was told that she's wearing a spaghetti strap blouse. A couple weeks ago, JFJ received a report, where the young lady called the police station to say, officer, I'm being abused, I need your help. She was told that there is no police car available. No support came. She called back the next day. The officer told her that he wasn't aware that she still needed the support. These are the types of stories that we've heard, the experiences of people. Now, to be fair to the Jamaica Constabulary Force and the government, they have established what they call the Domestic Violence Intervention Centers, being headed by Jacqueline Delon, who has been very approachable, I believe. They have extended a number of trainings to these officers. My question to you, Father Sean, based on what I've just indicated, what more can be done to improve the response of the state in these situations?
Well, whatever resources they may be empowered with would help, but certainly establishing mandatory response procedures would make a big difference. The law should mandate law enforcement to respond to all credible reports of domestic violence that involve physical violence to correct existing shortcomings in police response and to transform negative culture surrounding domestic violence. You know, it's interesting, we're talking about domestic violence, but something coming back to mind, and it was around a child abuse situation. I witnessed a parent walking into a school devotion, took off his belt and used the buckle and badly beat a child. And I proceeded to call the police. The father who committed the act, he was outside in the schoolyard. And when the police turned up, they don't know who they're turning up for, but I heard one of the police officers said, "But my friend that?" And I said, "John, are you that?" "But look here, a long time I not see you." And the police have a nice, wonderful conversation while another police agent went into the school to, hear what was the problem all about, because in the school, the required personnel were prepared to respond to the police in the event that the police showed up. Only for them to realize that is the person who his colleague was greeting nicely and warmly, who was really the culprit. And nothing much happened after that, So,
Yes.
with regards to the responses, an entirely new section should be added to the Domestic Violence Act to address this matter.
All right.
And it is the submission of JFJ that the Act should make it mandatory for a police officer to respond to every complaint
Absolutely.
or report alleging domestic violence.
Thank you so much, Father Sean. I'm going to give the last word. Patrick will be with us. So, Patrick, we're not ignoring you, but you're in studio, so we soon come back over to you. But I'm going to give the last word to Dr. Carpenter. Rochelle, we will start with you. Your last word, your last call, then Dr. Carpenter, and then we close out. Go ahead, Rochelle, and then Dr. Carpenter.
For me, it's really that we should see domestic violence as is important. We should see these survivors as important, and so we need to be deliberate in our actions in terms of getting justice for these persons who are affected by it. It is just for everybody. When it comes to the whole, we talk about the 2014, the whole continuing working, but what are we really doing? We can go on, and the cycle continues, but there are persons affected every day. So it's important that we are deliberate every single day to ensure that whatever work we are putting, that we are serving the people of the country.
Absolutely. Dr. Carpenter, your last word. We're up on a
Thank
break.
you. And I want to commend the work of JFJ in putting together this program. Each week that I watch, I am heartened to see that there are attempts to bring the information to the public. And I think that's one of the things that must be done. We actually should have 3-4 channels from the government agencies getting the information about the laws to the public,
Yes.
so the public can be informed, they can be educated, and they can make good decisions. So that's thing one. NGOs and private organizations and CSOs ought not to be bearing the responsibility of the state to educate its people. Second, where we come in as NGOs, CSOs, and the like, for instance, the Jamaican Psychological Society, of which I'm a member, we now have a task of helping the Jamaican populace to understand culturally the difference between what they consider madness, which is a term we use,
Yes.
someone walking around vagrant and living on the streets, and mental health issues that involve crises, violence, and abuse. We have a big task in front of us to help people to truly understand what it means to suffer from a mental health issue and how these are treated. So those are my two most important points at this point.
Thank you so much. That was Dr. Karen Carpenter, Miss Rochelle Gray, Father Sean Major Campbell, and of course Patrick Layla will continue with us in studio. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. We're just going to take a break and then we return. All right. The technical team, but thanks again to the guests. We appreciate you. Patrick, Jade, one of the questions that coming into us, where are we talking only about women? Aren't men also affected?
Okay.
Well, I just want to say it is not even a colloquial thing at this point. Statistically, women are disproportionately affected by these kinds of violence. They're most likely to be the victims of these kinds of violence. I could quote off some alarming numbers for you, but the point is that we focus on women because that is where we have seen the need to address the issue in a more expeditious manner.
Great, but I also want to point out that we're not forgetting our men and boys. JFJ, for example, we've had several complaints coming in from men. We have asked for the Domestic Violence Act, the Sexual Offences Act, and so on to remain gender neutral. One of the issues that we have also called for, Patrick, if you recall, when you wrote the submission for JASL, actually, for the rape to be redefined.
Okay.
And what was the response, if you recall?
They are not looking anywhere in that direction. They are bogged down with some savings law clauses in the Constitution, and that this may be...
That can be amended by a 2/3 majority vote.
Yes, that of course, and that this may be... I think the whole issue...
No, I wanted to finish the thought. What has the government indicated in that report? Let's put this to the referendum.
So let us be very clear. The savings law clauses that they speak of, which is in the Constitution, can be amended. But just like how you need a 2/3 majority to get the SOE passed, it's the same thing.
But you cannot go down there.
The same thing.
Let's take a break and then we come back.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We are talking about our laws related to gender-based violence, and we are now in the call-in section of the show. So if you are listening and you'd like to share some thoughts on our topic this week or ask any questions, you can call in the studio at 876-676-4996, or you can send a WhatsApp message to 876-239-7583. We are still joined by Mr. Layla in studio. And while we are listening now for our callers, what can be done to seek assistance if you're experiencing domestic violence? We understand there are gaps, but what is there now that we can utilize if you are a victim?
All right. So in terms of let me start with the law, because also there are the social support pieces. But I think people need to, while the protection order has its limitations, until we fix that, I think it is more of enforcement. That is the problem. So people need to go to the courts, apply for the order. Just go to the family division of the parish court if you are in one of the rural areas where it's just the parish court. Everything happens there. Just go to the court's office, tell them that you'd like to get a protection order, and the process will start right there. The clerk or the person you speak to there will show you how to go about doing that. And it can be had what they call ex parte, which means the abuser don't have to be there if the court is sufficiently convinced that the abuser is making himself unavailable. You can get the order without his presence.
And fast track it through what they call the interim.
So you can get an interim order if they think the matter is a serious matter. The interim order will have a cutoff point. Then you will be required for the accused to be served so that he can appear before the court for you to get a more permanent order. That you can also get ex parte if the person, because there are methods that the court will use. He will be served. If the person is deliberately making themselves unavailable, then the court will act to deal with the matter. But I want to go on the part of enforcement, because fine, getting the protection order.
But before you move on, I want 2 clarifications. What's the difference between a protection and an occupation order? and what can persons expect to be protected against?
All right. So the occupation order really has to do with premises. So as the term suggests, occupation, occupy. So there are instances when you particularly instances when women have children living on premises that are either owned by or paid for, if it's a rented premises, by the abuser. In the occupation order normally goes alongside the protection order, so it's not one or the other. Generally, an occupation order don't come into play if there's not a protection order. And then what it does is give the victim or the survivor the opportunity to occupy that premises owned by the abuser while the abuser is restricted from the premises. Sounds scary, but it is the law. And then also in cases where it's a rented premises, the abuser can be restricted from the premises but ordered to continue to pay the rent.
And the protection?
The protection order, basically, it will vary from case to case, and it's not one size fit all. The protection order comes with parameters, so it may be based on what your report is. The person can be barred from, say, he must not be seen in Waterhouse, the community of Waterhouse. He must not come to your place of work, must not come to your place of business, must not come to your educational institution if you go to school, must not call or text your phone, must make no attempt to get in contact with you, whether by a phone, in writing, and stuff like that. So it will outline, generally, if you are saying this person is stalking me, if I go to the supermarket, I see them, on top of abusing me, he's now coming to my workplace, he's now coming to the old age home where he knows I visit my mom every Sunday, all of that.
So who can get the protection?
Well, any person who is in it can be in the protection order can be issued to any member of a household, not just in an intimate
So the child,
relationship, but it can be
the child,
a
the
domestic.
elderly.
So the child, the elderly, and siblings, if the violence is being committed, brother and sister, and they say men could be brother and brother too.
So the visiting relationship, I want to clarify that.
All right,
part.
so visiting relationships, the law speaks of visiting relationships, which is where you have your partner and you don't live together. You come and go, sometimes you spend weekend, you spend a week, you spend a couple of days, you overnight. Visiting relationships are recognized under the Domestic Violence Act, and people in visiting relationships can get protection orders again. But the important thing is, and I want people to remember this, when you get the protection order and the order is violated, you should report it immediately. Now, Rochelle said the ball is dropped at the police, and I think this is where the ball is dropped. Because the legislation clearly states if someone report that the order has been breached, the police is to take the person in custody forthwith, and they are not to be released on bond. So station bail don't come into question. Once you are being taken into custody for the breach of the order, you are supposed to be held in custody until there is a court.
We're coming up in the last minute,
Yes.
but I want to give you an opportunity. I don't want Candace Livermore to call us. Tell us about Jostle's services.
All right, so at Jamaica AIDS Support for Life, we offer full HIV services, testing, counseling, treatment, preventative services, and also as it relates to gender-based violence that we are discussing. This is important for us because there's a strong connection where many people mostly women become HIV positive as a result of violence, being in violent relationships, as a result of sexual violence. So we offer services to those women, to counseling services, legal support services if you find yourself in that situation.
And your
just
number
call
is?
out. And our number is 925-0021.
All right.
And you can reach us on all social media platforms.
Right, over to Jade.
Okay, so we are in the last rapid fire minute. We had gotten one comment from one of of our viewers asking why the government is not doing public education in this area. Unfortunately, we are not representatives of the government, so we can't speak to why that is the case, but what we can say is that Jamaicans for Justice does do public education in this area, and if you or your organization would like to reach out to us to see if we can facilitate a training or do some kind of educational or sensitization session, we can do that. So let us know if that's the kind of assistance you need. We have gotten the response to our trivia question. The answer for our question today was 6 months, and the question was, at what is the term of imprisonment that you can receive if a protection order is breached? We did have a winner. I believe this is an IG handle. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce it at this time, but our communications officer will reach out to you and you'll receive your $1,000 credit as your gift. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Lalo. And
my pleasure.
We are...
All right, so we'll see you all next week, and remember to tune in to the PBC YouTube for the bail bill submission that JFJ made. I'm Michael Jackson, Executive Director.
And I'm Jade Williams, Policy and Advocacy Specialist. That's Thursday, by the way, 2 p.m.
Yes.